Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, the channel for stories of grit, betrayal, and redemption under the vast, open skies of the American West. If you're a fan of grizzled gunslingers, resilient women, and the untamed frontier, go on and hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss a single one of our adventures. Now, settle in by the fire, listen to the wind howl through the canyons, and let us take you into today's tale. A story of a lonely man, a hunted woman, and a choice that could cost them both everything. The sun was a hammered brass anvil in the Montana sky, beating the air into shimmering waves that danced over the Badlands. For Jedediah Jed Stone, the silence of this country was both a blessing and a curse. It had soaked into his bones over 20 years. Ever since his Martha was laid to rest under the lone cottonwood in a 50-mile radius, and his only boy had gone east in search of a life not caked in dust and solitude. His ranch, a stubborn patch of resilience built with sweat and blood, was his kingdom and his prison. The day was like any other. Jed was on his trusted old mare, Dusty, checking the southwest fence line. It was a thankless, repetitive job, but it was honest. It was his. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the brim of his sweat-stained hat. It was in this oppressive stillness that he first saw a key splash of faded calico against the dun-colored earth, a wrongness in the landscape. Vultures were beginning to circle, lazy black specks against the merciless blue. Jed wasn't a man given to hurry, but he nudged Dusty into a steady trot, his curiosity pricked by a sliver of unease. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a person. A woman, or rather a girl, sprawled beside a cluster of sagebrush as if she'd been dropped from the sky. One leg was bent at an unnatural angle, the denim of her trousers torn and dark with blood. Her face, turned to the side, was pale beneath a mask of grime and dried tears, her lips cracked and blistered. A canteen lay a few feet from her outstretched hand, dented and obviously empty. She was small, fine-boned, looking as though a strong gust of wind might carry her away. She didn't belong here. Nobody did. This was desolate, unforgiving country, miles from any town or homestead. Jed dismounted, the leather of his saddle creaking in the profound silence. He approached cautiously, his hand resting near the butt of the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. Out here, caution was what kept a man alive. He knelt beside her, his shadow falling across her still form. He pressed his calloused fingers to the side of her neck. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a faint, thready flutter. A hummingbird's wingbeat. She was alive. Barely. Her hair, a tangled mess of dark chestnut, was matted with dirt and what looked like blood. A nasty gash ran along her temple. But it was the injury to her leg that was most severe. A deep, ragged tear in her calf, crusted over with black blood and buzzing with flies. It looked like she'd caught it on a shard of rock or a rusted strand of barbed wire. Whatever had happened, she'd been out here for a while. With a grunt, Jed uncorked his own canteen. He gently lifted her head, cradling it in his arm, and let a trickle of water flow over her lips. At first, she didn't respond. Then, a faint, instinctual swallowing motion. Her eyelids flickered. She moaned, a sound so faint it was nearly lost to the wind. Jed poured a little more, watching as the life-giving liquid seemed to coax a flicker of consciousness back into her. Getting her onto Dusty was a clumsy, difficult affair. She was light, but dead weight, and her pain gasps with every movement were like barbs in Jed's conscience. He eventually managed to settle her in front of him in the saddle, her head lolling against his chest. Her breathing was shallow, a fragile rhythm against the steady beat of his own heart. As he turned Dusty toward home, he took one last look at the empty expanse where he'd found her. There were no tracks but her own stumbling, dragging prints that told a story of exhaustion and desperation before they finally gave out. She was alone. Whatever she was running from, she hadn't outrun it. It had simply let her go, leaving her for the sun and the vultures. The ride back to the ranch was long and slow. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The girl in his arms drifted in and out of a feverish consciousness, muttering words he couldn't catch, her body trembling with chills despite the evening's residual warmth. Jed held her steady, his mind a churn of questions. Who was she? Where did she come from? What trouble had found her in this god-forsaken corner of the world? He arrived at his homestead as twilight bled into night. The small, sturdy ranch house was a solitary silhouette against the deepening dark. It was a place built for one, a fortress of solitude. Tonight, for the first time in a decade, it would house two. He carried her inside, the scent of dust, blood, and sun-scorched earth clinging to her. He laid her gently on his own beta bed that had felt far too large since Martha was gone. For the next several hours, Jed worked with a practiced, gentle efficiency he hadn't used in years. He lit the lamps, their golden glow pushing back the shadows. He heated water on the wood stove. He found Martha's old sewing kit, the needles still sharp, and a bottle of whiskey for cleaning the wound. He cut away the ruined fabric of her trousers, his movements careful and impersonal. The gash was deep and inflamed, angry red lines streaking away from it. He cleaned it as best he could, her sharp hisses of pain the only sounds in the quiet room. He stitched the wound closed with neat, tight sutures, his large, rough hands surprisingly steady. He bandaged it with clean strips of an old shirt. He washed the grime from her face with a damp cloth, revealing delicate features and the dark smudges of exhaustion beneath her eyes. He pulled a chair to the bedside and sat, watching her in the lamplight. She had settled into a deep, fever-addled sleep. Her face, even in repose, was etched with a profound fear. Her hands, resting on the quilt, were clenched into small fists. She was a stray, a wounded bird that had fallen into his isolated world. He felt a stir of something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. It wasn't pity, not exactly. It was a sense of responsibility, a purpose beyond the endless cycle of sunup and sundown. Outside, the coyotes began their nightly chorus. The wind sighed around the corners of the house. Jed sat his vigil, the silence of his life momentarily broken. He didn't know if he had just saved a life or invited a world of trouble into his home. As he watched the unsteady rise and fall of her chest, he realized that for the first time in years, he truly didn't care. He had made his choice when he lifted her from the dust. The consequences would have to wait for dawn. The fever held her for 3 days. It was a tenacious, malevolent thing, wringing the sweat from her body and filling the small bedroom with her delirious murmurs. Jed became her shadow, a constant, quiet presence. He spooned broth and water between her parched lips, changed the dressings on her leg, and placed cool, damp cloths on her forehead. He listened to her fragmented whispers, disjointed words tumbling out in the dark. "Now, please, run. The river. It wasn't me." They were pieces of a puzzle he couldn't assemble, hints of a terror he couldn't comprehend. In these moments, she wasn't a stranger, she was a frightened child lost in a nightmare. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. Jed entered the room as the first pale light of dawn filtered through the window, and he found her awake. Her eyes, the color of moss after a rain, were open and lucid, tracking his every move. The fear in them was palpable, a wild, cornered animal terror that made her flinch when he came near. "Easy now," he said, his voice a low rumble, consciously gentle. "You're safe here." She said nothing, simply watched him, her body tense and ready to bolt, though her wounded leg made that impossible. He left a plate of biscuits and a glass of fresh milk on the nightstand and retreated, giving her the space she so clearly craved. He spent the day mending a harness in the barn, the rhythmic work of his hands a comfort in the face of the tense silence that had settled over his house. He could feel her presence like a change in the weather, a low-pressure system of fear and suspicion. Slowly, tentatively, she began to emerge. First, she would only take the food when he was out of the house. Then, she would sit in the chair by the window, a silent sentinel wrapped in one of Martha's old quilts, watching the vast, empty landscape. She moved with a pronounced limp, but with a surprising resilience. Jed never pushed, never asked the questions that burned on his tongue: her name, her past, the reason she was nearly dead in his pasture. He learned long ago that silence often yielded more truth than interrogation. He simply went about his routine, mending fences, tending his small herd of cattle, and breaking horses, all the while acutely aware of the pair of watchful eyes from the house. One afternoon, a week after she'd woken, he came in from the stables, weary and covered in dust, to find the scent of something other than stale air and solitude. It was the smell of baking bread. On the cooling rack sat 2 perfectly formed, golden brown loaves. The girl was by the sink, her back to him, washing the dishes. She didn't turn, but her shoulders stiffened. "Smells good," Jed said, breaking the silence. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a beginning. From that day on, she began to claim small spaces in his life. She started cooking their meals, simple but hearty fare that filled the house with a warmth it hadn't known in years. She mended his work shirts with stitches as fine and neat as his own surgical work on her leg. She swept the floors. She never spoke unless spoken to, and her answers were brief, clipped monosyllables. But her actions spoke of a quiet gratitude, a desire to earn her keep. Jed discovered she had a way with animals. He found her one morning in the corral with Diablo, a fiery young stallion that had fought him at every turn. The horse, usually a bundle of nervous energy and aggression, stood perfectly still as she stroked his muzzle, murmuring to him in a voice too low for Jed to hear. The wildness in the horse seemed to recognize and gentle the wildness in her. Slowly, the fragile shell of her fear began to crack. One evening, as they sat at the table, the only sounds the clinking of forks and the crackle of the fire, Jed was recounting a story about a particularly stubborn bull from his youth. He wasn't even sure why he was talking, just filling the silence. He finished the story with a dry chuckle, and from across the table, he heard a small, breathy sound. He looked up. A smile, faint and fleeting as a firefly, touched her lips before vanishing. It was the first time he had seen it, and it transformed her face, chasing away the shadows of fear and exhaustion. "My name is Alara," she said, her voice soft, a little rusty from disuse. Jed simply nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Jedediah," he replied. It was just a name, a simple exchange, but it felt like a treaty being signed. A truce with the past. The unspoken things still hung in the air between them, or secrets, his solitude, but they were no longer a wall. They were just shadows in a room that was, for the first time, filled with a tentative light. The days settled into a new rhythm, a shared routine that was as comfortable as an old pair of boots. They worked together, often in silence, but it was a companionable silence now, not a tense one. He taught her how to mend the fence wire, and she showed him how to properly knead dough. He found himself talking more, sharing stories of Martha, of his son, of the ranch as it used to be. He was unlocking parts of himself he thought had rusted shut forever. He watched her limp lessen, the color return to her cheeks, the haunted look in her eyes recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity. Her presence had become the new center of his world. The lonely house no longer felt empty, it felt like a home. The silence was no longer a marker of loss, it was a space of shared peace. In the vast and caring wilderness of his life, Jedediah Stone had found an unexpected, fragile blossom of companionship. He had saved her from the desert, but he was slowly realizing that she, in her own quiet way, was saving him from a different kind of wasteland. He started to think of it as permanence, this quiet life they were building. He let himself believe that the storm she had run from had passed her by for good. It was a comfortable, dangerous illusion. The larder was getting low. It was a fact of life that Jed could no longer ignore. The monthly trip to Clearwater, a dusty collection of buildings that barely qualified as a town, was a necessity. In the past, it was a chore he performed with stoic indifference. Now, the thought of leaving the ranch, of leaving Alara, filled him with a strange and unfamiliar anxiety. He'd grown accustomed to her quiet presence, to the rhythm they had established. The thought of the house returning to its hollow silence, even for a day, was deeply unsettling. "I've got to ride into town for supplies," he announced at breakfast, trying to keep his tone casual. Alara looked up from her plate, her fork frozen midair. The cautious peace in her eyes flickered, replaced by a familiar shadow of fear. "Town?" she asked, the word barely a whisper. "Just for the day. We're low on flour and salt. I'll be back before sundown." She didn't argue, but a silent tension settled between them. He watched as she packed a small canvas sack with bread and jerky for his journey, her movements precise and withdrawn. When he saddled Dusty in the pale morning light, she stood at the doorway of the ranch house, a small, solitary figure against the vast backdrop of the plains. She looked like she wanted to shrink into the very wood of the doorframe. He gave her a nod, a silent promise to return, and rode out. The image of her worried face seared into his mind. Clearwater was as he'd left it, a single dusty street flanked by sun-bleached wooden buildings. Horses stood hitched to rails, their tails flicking lazily at flies. Men in worn denim and sweat-stained hats watched him from the porch of the general store, their gazes lingering with the idle curiosity of small-town life. Jed nodded curtly and went about his business. He bought flour, coffee, beans, and a sack of salted pork from Mr. Henderson at the general store, the smells of leather, tobacco, and dry goods filling the air. He exchanged brief pleasantries, answering the usual questions about his cattle with noncommittal grunts. His last stop was the sheriff's office to see if there was any mail. Sheriff Miller, a man whose guts strained the buttons of his shirt, sat with his boots propped on his desk, looking bored. "Jed," he grunted in greeting. "Ain't seen you in a while. Nothin' for you. Just the usual notices." He gestured with a thumb toward a bulletin board cluttered with land deeds, auction notices, and wanted posters. Jed's eyes scanned the board out of habit. His gaze drifted over the crudely drawn faces of train robbers and horse thieves. Then, it stopped. His blood ran cold. The drawing was rough, etched in thick black ink, but the likeness was undeniable. The shape of the face, the high cheekbones, the wide, dark eyes. It was Ilara. Her hair was depicted as wild and unkempt, her expression twisted into a snarling caricature of menace, but it was her. Beneath the drawing, bold letters spelled out a name he didn't recognize, Eliza the Wren Wainwright. Jed's breath hitched in his chest. His heart began a slow, heavy pounding against his ribs. He forced himself to read the words printed below the name. Wanted, dead or alive, for the crime of armed robbery and the murder of Deputy Samuel Griggs. Last seen fleeing the vicinity of the Rock Creek Stagecoach Massacre. Known to be armed and exceedingly dangerous. The words blurred. Murder. Massacre. Exceedingly dangerous. He stared at the description, at the vicious crimes attributed to the quiet, gentle woman who baked his bread and soothed his horses with soft murmurs. It felt like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. At the bottom of the poster, another number made his stomach clench. Reward of $500. $500. It was a fortune. More money than he'd seen in 5 years. Enough to buy a new bull, fix the roof on the barn, hire a real ranch hand, and live without the constant fear of foreclosure. It was a life-changing sum. "See something that catches your eye?" Sheriff Miller asked, his voice laced with amusement. Jed tore his gaze from the poster, hoping his face betrayed none of the turmoil raging within him. "Just the usual scum," he managed to say, his voice sounding distant and strange to his own ears. "This one? Wainwright. What's the story?" Miller swung his boots off the desk and leaned forward, eager for a bit of gossip. "Oh, she's a nasty piece of work, that one. Part of the Black Creek gang. They hit the federal stage over by Rock Creek 2 months back. Killed 2 guards and that poor young Deputy Griggs. They say she's the worst of the lot. Vicious as a rattlesnake. Calls herself the Wren 'cause she's small and quick. Slit a man's throat for his boots. Or so the story goes." Every word was a hammer blow, shattering the fragile peace Jed had built. Vicious as a rattlesnake. He thought of her gentle hands mending his shirt, the fleeting smile that had lit up her face. The two images warred in his mind, irreconcilable. "They catch the rest of the gang?" Jed asked, forcing himself to remain steady. "Most of 'em," Miller said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "Hanged a couple in Helena last month, but she slipped through the cracks. Headed this way, some say. $500 is a lot of temptation. Every bounty man from here to the Dakotas is probably sniffing around for her." Jed's blood turned to ice. Bounty man. Ruthless hunters who would shoot first and ask questions later, if at all. He felt a surge of something fierce and protective, immediately followed by a wave of nauseating doubt. What if it was true? What if he was harboring a cold-blooded killer? He thanked the sheriff, his voice a dry rasp, and left the office, the bright sunlight of the street feeling harsh and accusatory. He stuffed his supplies into his saddlebags, his movements stiff and jerky. The wanted poster was burned into his memory, its stark black and white image overlaying every thought. He had to have it. With a furtive glance around the street, he slipped back to the side of the sheriff's office. The bulletin board was visible through the dusty window. When he was sure no one was looking, he reached over, tore the poster from the board with a single sharp rip, and stuffed it deep into his coat pocket. The rough paper felt like a coiled snake against his chest. The ride home was a torment. The familiar landscape seemed alien and menacing. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered accusation. Dusty's steady gait, usually a comfort, was now a rhythmic countdown to a confrontation he didn't know how to begin. He replayed every moment with Alara. Her silence, which he had interpreted as shyness and fear, was it actually cunning? Her gentleness with the animals a clever deception. The fragmented words from her fevered sleep took on a sinister new meaning. Run. It wasn't me. Was that the plea of an innocent or the denial of the guilty? He had saved a woman from the wilderness, only to bring a far greater danger into his home. The questions circled in his mind like the vultures he had seen that first day. Who was she? The gentle, wounded girl he had nursed back to health, or the murderous wren on the poster? As his ranch came into view, a speck of order in the vast chaos of the plains, he saw her. She was standing by the corral, just as he'd seen her with Diablo, one hand resting on the neck of the stallion. From this distance, she looked small, peaceful, and utterly harmless. The image was so profoundly at odds with the violent words on the paper in his pocket that his heart felt as if it were being torn in two. He slowed Dusty to a walk, the weight of his discovery, and the terrible choice it represented, settling upon him like a shroud. The sun was setting, and the longest night of Jedediah Stone's life was about to begin. The setting sun cast a long shadow before Jed as he rode the final stretch to the ranch. It was as if the darkness in his heart was physically projecting itself onto the land ahead. He saw her by the corral, her hand on Diablo's neck, a picture of such profound peace that it felt like a deliberate lie. The gentle girl and the vicious killer, Eliza the Wren Wainwright, were two separate beings, and yet they inhabited the same small body. As he dismounted, the weary creak of the saddle leather sounded unnaturally loud, an announcement of his troubled return. Alara turned, a hopeful look on her face that soured into concern as she saw his expression. He was a man of few words, but his face was an open book of his emotions, and right now it was a grim, tightly bound volume. "Is everything all right, Jedediah?" she asked, her voice carrying the same soft timbre that now sent a shiver of doubt down his spine. "Fine," he grunted, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. He couldn't meet her eyes. He busied himself with unstrapping the supplies, his movements stiff and economical. He felt her gaze on him, questioning, but she said nothing more. Dinner was a tortuous affair. The food she had prepared, a savory beef stew that would normally have been a comfort, was tasteless to him. The silence, once a companionable space between them, was now a chasm filled with unspoken accusations. He watched her across the small wooden table, the lamplight casting flickering shadows on her face. He watched her hands as she ate, the same hands that had tended his horses, kneaded his bread, and stitched his clothes. He tried to imagine them holding a bloody knife, as the story Sheriff Miller had told suggested. He tried to see the rattlesnake viciousness in her moss-green eyes, but he saw only a quiet sorrow, a deep-seated weariness, and a flicker of fear as she watched him watch her. She was the first to break. "You're quiet tonight," she said softly. "Did something happen in town?" Jed pushed his half-empty bowl away. He could feel the folded paper in his coat pocket, a square of poison resting against his chest. "Town's the same as it ever was," he said, his voice flat. He wanted to scream the questions at her. "Did you murder a man? Were you part of a massacre? Is your entire existence here a lie?" But the words wouldn't come, because a part of him, a stubborn, foolish part, was terrified of the answer. If she said yes, the fragile world he had rebuilt would be obliterated. The warmth that had seeped back into his life would be gone, replaced by the cold reality of betrayal. And if she said no, could he even believe her? After the pretense of their meal was over, she cleared the table, her movements as quiet as a ghost. Jed remained seated, the weight in his gut like a lead sinker. He knew he couldn't let it lie. For his own safety, for the sake of the law he had always, in his own quiet way, respected. And for her. He owed her the accusation, if only to see how she would meet it. He waited until she had finished in the kitchen. He stoked the fire, the flames leaping up, casting dancing devils on the cabin walls. The wind had picked up outside, a low, mournful howl that seemed to echo the turmoil inside him. He sat in his worn armchair, the one opposite the hearth, and waited. She came and sat on the small stool by the fire, a position she had taken many nights before, mending clothes or simply watching the flames. Tonight, she just sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, waiting for the axe to fall. Jed didn't speak for a long time. He simply stared into the fire, wrestling with the two versions of the woman beside him. There was Alara, the gentle soul who had healed a part of him he thought was long dead. And there was Eliza Wainwright, the killer with a $500 price on her head. A sum that could save his ranch. A sum that could condemn a person, guilty or innocent. He thought of the law. Deputy Samuel Griggs. A young man, Miller had said. A man with a life, a future, cut short. Justice demanded a reckoning for that. His duty as a citizen, as a man of conscience, was clear. He should ride back to Clearwater at first light and tell Sheriff Miller that the wren had flown right into his coop. It was the safe, logical, and profitable thing to do. But then he thought of her, feverish and helpless in his bed. He remembered the flash of a genuine smile, the trust she had shown his most volatile horse. He thought of the quiet way she had filled the echoing silence of his home. Handing her over felt like a betrayal of a trust he himself had fostered. It felt like trapping an animal he had nursed back to health only to hand it to the wolves. Those bounty men Miller had mentioned. They wouldn't care about justice. They cared about gold. They would see her as a walking sack of coins, and they wouldn't be gentle in their collection. His heart was at war with his head. The rancher, the pragmatist, told him to cut his losses and take the reward. The man, the lonely, grieving man who had been offered a second chance at companionship, roared in protest. Finally, with a hand that trembled slightly, he reached into his coat. He pulled out the crumpled wanted poster. The paper crackled in the silent room, a sound as loud as a gunshot. He didn't look at her. He simply leaned forward and placed it on the small crate between them, smoothing it out with his palm. The crude drawing of her face stared up from the paper, illuminated by the firelight. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The poster said it all. He finally lifted his eyes and met hers. The desperation he saw there was a physical blow. But behind it, there was something else, something that chilled him to the bone, a flicker of guilt, a shadow of resignation, as if this was a moment she had been expecting and dreading. Since the day he found her, her mask of fragile peace was gone, and what lay beneath was a terrifying, heartbreaking mix of the hunted animal and the cornered sinner. The name on the poster hung in the air between them, an unholy ghost. Eliza the Wren Wainwright. Ilariel starred at the paper, her face a mask of pale, frozen horror. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking as fragile as she had the day he found her. She didn't deny it. The fight seemed to leave her body in one long, shuddering sigh, a surrender to the inevitable. My pa, she began, her voice a raw, broken whisper. He was a gambler. Always chasing a score, always owing the wrong men. He fell in with the Black Creek gang. Said it was one last job, enough to get us clear, to start over. Jed listened, his expression unreadable, his gut twisting into a knot. I wasn't part of it, she pleaded, her eyes finally lifting to meet his, swimming with tears. I was just with him. They hit the stage. It all went wrong so fast. There was shooting. So much shooting. She choked on a sob, wrapping her arms around herself. Deputy Griggs. He was just a boy. The gang's leader, a man named Silas. He shot him. When it was over, my pa was dead too. Silas said I was a witness. Said I was as guilty as the rest of them. He took the money and ran, and left me there. So you ran, Jed finished, his voice flat. It was a plausible story. The story of a victim, caught in the gears of other men's violence. But it was still just a story. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, she whispered. I thought I was going to die out there. And then you found me. Before Jed could process this, before he could decide whether to believe the desperate plea in her eyes or the cold, hard facts on the poster, a new sound cut through the night. It was the rhythmic drumming of hoofbeats, too many for a lone rider. They were approaching the ranch, fast and purposeful. Eliza's head snapped up, the blood-drained look on her face replaced by sheer, primal terror. They found me, she breathed. Jed was on his feet in an instant. He strode to the window, peering through a crack in the curtains. 3 riders were silhouetted against the moonlit horizon, their forms dark and menacing. Bounty hunters. They moved with the predatory confidence of wolves closing in on a kill. Get in the cellar, he commanded, his voice low and urgent. He grabbed his Winchester rifle from its pegs on the wall, his action swift and instinctual. The time for deliberation was over. The choice had been made for him. "No, Jedediah, you don't understand," she cried, grabbing his arm. "They'll kill you for helping me. Let me go. It's me they want." "I found you on my land," he said, his voice a hard growl as he checked the rifle's action. "That makes you my business. Now get down there." There was no time to argue. A voice hailed them from the yard, smooth and oily with false pleasantry. "Hello, the house. We're looking for a Jedediah Stone. We've got business with you." Jed shoved Eliza toward the trapdoor to the root cellar hidden beneath a bearskin rug. He gave her a final look. "Stay down. And stay quiet." He closed the heavy door over her just as a loud bang echoed on the front door of the house. Jed walked to the door, Winchester held loosely at his side. "Use a skin," he called out. "Name's Silas Kane," the voice replied. The name hit Jed like a physical blow. "Silas, the man from Eliza's story. I'm a duly deputized agent of the law, old man. We tracked a fugitive to your property, a murderer named Eliza Wainwright. We know she's in there. Send her out, and there'll be no trouble for you." "Don't know anyone by that name," Jed lied, his heart hammering against his ribs. A cruel chuckle answered him. "Don't play dumb. We heard in Clearwater how you tore her poster right off the sheriff's wall. Now, I can offer you $100 for your cooperation, or I can burn this shack to the ground with you inside it. The choice is yours." Jed's mind raced. It was them. The Black Creek Gang. Or what was left of it. They weren't bounty hunters. They were her former partners, tying up a loose end. And the leader, Silas, was standing right outside his door. Eliza hadn't been lying. In that instant, all doubt vanished, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. He wasn't protecting a killer. He was protecting a witness. He was standing between her and the very men who had murdered a deputy and left her for dead. The world narrowed to the wooden door in front of him and the rifle in his hands. He thought of Martha, of the promise he'd made to live an honorable life. He thought of the empty years and the brief, bright warmth Eliza had brought back into his home. He wasn't going to let them extinguish it. Without another word, Jed kicked over the heavy oak table, sending it crashing to the floor as a makeshift barricade. He dropped to one knee behind it just as the front window exploded inward in a shower of glass, a shotgun blast tearing a fist-sized hole in the opposite wall. The fight was on. The next few minutes were a cacophony of thunderous reports, splintering wood, and shouting. Jed was not a gunfighter, but he was a rancher. He knew his home, its angles, its strengths. He fired the Winchester with a steady, methodical aim, not to kill, but to keep them back, to make them think twice. Another shotgun blast tore through the door. A bullet whined past his ear, smacking into the stone of the hearth. Suddenly, the trapdoor behind him creaked open. Eliza emerged, her face pale but her eyes blazing with fierce determination. In her hands, she held Jed's old Colt Peacemaker, which he kept loaded in a box in the cellar. "I can shoot," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "My pa made sure of that." She scrambled to the other side of the cabin, taking a position by the small side window. Now there were two of them, a united front. The fight raged. Gunsmoke filled the small cabin, stinging their eyes. Outside, Silas Kane cursed, his frustration growing. "Just rush the damn place," he roared to his men. As one of them made a dash for the door, a shot rang out from Eliza's position. The man cried out and fell, clutching his leg. She was a crack shot. Jed laid down suppressing fire, forcing the other men back behind the water trough. It was a stalemate. Then, through the shattered window, Jed saw Silas Kane sneaking around the side of the house, heading for the barn. He was going to try and set it on fire, to smoke them out. "I've got to stop him," Jed said, reloading the Winchester. "Keep that other one pinned down." He slipped out the back door, using the darkness and outbuildings for cover. He moved with the quiet familiarity of a man on his own land. He saw Kane by the barn, a lit torch in his hand. "Kane!" Jed yelled. The man spun around, a sneer on his face, and raised his pistol. Both men fired at the same instant. A lance of fire erupted in Jed's left shoulder, a searing, white-hot pain that buckled his knees. But his own shot flew true. Silas Kane staggered back, dropping the torch, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He collapsed into the dust and lay still. The last gunman, seeing his leader fall, decided the fight wasn't worth the price. He scrambled onto his horse and galloped away into the darkness, a fading ghost against the plains. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the drop torch as it began to lick at the dry grass near the barn. Jed stumbled over and stomped it out, his whole body screaming in protest. Eliza rushed to his side, her face a mess of terror and relief. "You're hurt," she cried. "It's just a scratch," he lied, gritting his teeth against the wave of pain and dizziness. They stood there for a moment in the moonlit yard, amidst the carnage. Two dead men lay in the dust of the home Jed had built for peace and solitude. The battle was over. But as Jed looked at Eliza, and at the long, dark road that stretched out beyond his fences, he knew the war for their survival had just begun. The adrenaline of the gunfight gave way to the grim reality of its aftermath. The scent of gunpowder hung heavy in the air, a foul incense desecrating the familiar smells of hay and earth. Eliza, her hands surprisingly steady, tore strips from her own petticoat and, with whiskey from Jed's bottle, cleaned and bound his shoulder wound. It was a deep, searing tear through the muscle, painful but not fatal. He bore the pain with stoic silence, his gaze fixed on her face as she worked. He saw no fear in her now, only a hardened, sorrowful resolve. The girl he had saved was gone, replaced by the woman who had survived. "We have to go," she said, tying the last knot on the bandage. "When that other one gets back to wherever he's from, he'll talk. Sheriff Miller will put it all together. They'll come for us." Jed knew she was right. His quiet life was over, shattered the moment he chose to stand with her. The ranch, his sanctuary and his prison, was now a crime scene. To stay was to invite a noose or a prison cell. He looked around at the small cabin, at the chair where Martha used to sit, at the notches on the doorframe marking his son's growth. 2 decades of his life were contained within these walls. Leaving it felt like tearing off a limb. "Where would we go?" he asked, his voice weary. "There might be a way," Eliza said, a flicker of something new in her eyes. "Not hope, exactly, but a plan." Silas. He was always bragging. He kept a journal, wrote down everything, names, dates, who paid him what. He said it was his insurance. If he kept it on him, it might still be there. With a shared look, they walked over to the body of the man who had brought this bloody night upon them. The moon was high and bright, casting a sterile, silver light on his still face. Gritting his teeth against the revulsion, Jed searched Silas Kane's coat. And there, in an inside pocket, was a small, leather-bound book. They took it back inside, and by the flickering lamplight, they read. It was all there. A detailed, boastful account of the Rock Creek massacre, implicating Silas and the others by name. It described how he'd shot Deputy Griggs in cold blood and murdered Eliz's father to silence him. Most importantly, it completely exonerated her. It was the truth, written in the killer's own hand. "A federal marshal," Jed said, snapping the book shut. "We take this to a U.S. Marshal in a different territory. Someone beyond the reach of local politics and bounty claims. It's our only chance." Their path was set. As the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky a bruised purple, they began to pack. The choices were brutal. What do you take when you're leaving a life behind? Jed packed his tools, a bedroll, and his Winchester. He took the old, faded photograph of Martha and his son from the mantelpiece and tucked it carefully into his coat. Eliza gathered what little food they had left. Before they left, Jed walked alone to the lone cottonwood tree. He stood before the simple wooden cross that marked Martha's grave, his hat in his hand. "I'm sorry, Martha," he whispered to the wind. "I'm breaking my promise to stay. But I think you'd understand this one." He was leaving her, but he was choosing life. He was choosing the future over the past. He saddled Dusty for himself and the now tamed Diablo for Eliza. They didn't bother with the bodies in the yard. They left them for the vultures and for the law to find. It was better that way. Let the town of Clearwater think that Jedediah Stone and the fugitive woman had killed each other in a final, bloody dispute. It would buy them time. They mounted their horses, to solitary figures in the vast, waking landscape. Jed took one last look at the ranch house, a monument to a life that was now over. A profound sadness washed over him, but it was mingled with something else, a sense of purpose, a feeling he hadn't known since he was a young man building this place with his own 2 hands. Eliza rode up beside him, her face turned toward the rising sun. The light caught in her eyes, banishing the last of the shadows. She was no longer just the woman he had saved, she was his partner in this desperate and certain gamble. "Ready?" she asked softly. Jed looked from the grave of his wife to the living woman beside him. He looked at the endless horizon stretching out before them, a canvas of possibility and peril. He gave a single, decisive nod. "Ready." Together, they nudged their horses forward, leaving the ranch and the ghosts of their pasts behind them. They didn't know what lay ahead, only that they would face it together. The old, tattered wanted poster Jed had left on the floor of the cabin fluttered in the breeze from the broken window, a final, forgotten relic of a story that was already fading into legend as two riders, a quiet rancher and a woman wrongly accused, disappeared into the promise of a new dawn. The world beyond Jedediah's ranch was a vast, indifferent canvas of rock and sky. They rode hard for the first 2 days, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the life they had abandoned. They moved mostly at night, using the stars as their guide, the moon a silent, watchful companion. The silence between them was different now. It was not the silence of strangers, nor the comfortable quiet of companions. It was the tense, watchful silence of allies in a war, every rustle of the sagebrush, every distant coyote howl a potential threat. Jed's shoulder was a constant, throbbing agony. Despite Eliz's diligent care, the wound was a drain on his strength, and a fever sometimes clouded his thoughts. During these times, she took the lead. She navigated with an instinct he wouldn't have guessed she possessed, finding hidden springs for water and sheltered arroyos where they could make a cold, smokeless camp. He saw in her a resilience forged in a fire he could only imagine. She was no longer the frightened girl he'd found in the dust, she was a survivor, and he found himself relying on her as much as she relied on him. On the 5th day, their supplies ran dangerously low. They were in the Wyoming Territory now, a land even more rugged and sparsely populated than the Montana Badlands. Ahead of them lay a small, windswept settlement called Purgatory Creek, a name that did little to inspire confidence. It was little more than a trading post, a saloon, and a blacksmith, a temporary stop for trappers and prospectors. It was a risk, a necessary one. "I'll go in," Eliza said, her voice firm. "They're looking for a man and a woman. If I go in alone, buy what we need, and leave, I'll draw less attention. They'll be looking for you, the rancher who helped me." Jed hated the idea, his protective instincts warring with the logic of her plan. But looking at his own haggard reflection in a puddle, and the way his arm hung stiffly at his side, he knew she was right. He was a conspicuous man. He gave her most of their remaining cash and watched from a hidden ridge as she rode Diablo into the sorry excuse for a town. He watched her tie the horse outside the trading post, her movements calm and deliberate, a simple woman on a simple errand. From his vantage point, he felt a profound sense of helplessness. His fate was entirely in her hands. Inside the trading post, the air was thick with the smells of cured leather, chewing tobacco, and stale beer. Eliza kept her head down, gathering flour, coffee, and bacon. The storekeeper, a balding man with suspicious eyes, watched her every move. "You're new around here," he stated, more of an accusation than a question. "Just passing through," Eliza said, keeping her voice even. "Heading north to join my husband at the mining camps." As the man was weighing the flour, 2 men entered from the saloon, their spurs jingling on the wooden floorboards. They were grimy, hard-looking men, the kind who lived by their guns and their wits. "See this, Abe," one of them said, slapping a piece of paper down on the counter. New poster came in on the morning stage. Eliz's blood ran cold. She risked a sideways glance. It was a new wanted poster. The drawing of her was the same, but next to it was a new, surprisingly accurate sketch of Jedediah. Wanted, Jedediah Stone. Accomplice to the fugitive Eliza Wainwright. Wanted for the murder of 3 men at his homestead. Considered armed and extremely dangerous. 200 reward. The world seemed to tilt. They believed he had murdered Silas and his men. He was no longer a man of the law, but an outlaw in its eyes. The storekeeper squinted at the poster, then his eyes flickered toward Eliza. Her heart hammered in her chest. $200 for the old man, one of the bounty hunters mused. Add that to the 500 for the wren. That's a handsome sum. They say they were last seen heading south from Montana. Eliza forced herself to remain calm. She paid for her goods, her hands not trembling in the slightest. though it took every ounce of her willpower. "Have a good day, sir," she said to the storekeeper, her voice steady. She walked out of the store, feeling the weight of their eyes on her back. She untied Diablo, packed the supplies into the saddlebags, and mounted. She did not look back. She did not run. She nudged the horse into a calm, steady walk out of town, heading north, the direction she had claimed to be going. Once she was over the first rise and out of sight, she dug her heels into Diablo's flanks and galloped south, her heart a wild bird in her ribs. When she reached Jed, her face was pale, her news delivered in a rushed, terrified whisper. He was a wanted man, a murderer. The irony was a bitter pill. In the act of seeking justice, they had both been branded as criminals. Purgatory Creek was no longer just a name on a map, it was their reality. They were ghosts, haunted by a past that wasn't their own, and hunted for a price. The news that he was now a wanted murderer settled on Jed like a winter shroud. He had lived his life by a simple code of honor, and to see it stripped away and replaced with a criminal's brand was a deeper wound than the one in his shoulder. Their flight took on a new, desperate urgency. They pushed deeper into the Wyoming wilderness, into the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains, a jagged spine of rock and pine that offered cover but promised hardship. Jed's fever returned with a vengeance. The wound, despite Eliz's care, had become infected. He grew weaker, sometimes swaying in the saddle, his vision blurring. Eliza knew they couldn't keep going like this. He needed to rest. He needed a real shelter, a place to fight the fever before it consumed him. It was she who found it. Tucked away in a narrow, hidden valley, marked only by a thin curl of smoke, was a small, crudely built cabin. It was the home of a mountain man, a relic from a bygone era. They approached with caution, Eliza in the lead with the Colt drawn, Jed slumping over Dusty's neck. The man who emerged was as wild as the mountains themselves. He was old, with a long, grizzled beard and clothes made of buckskin, and he held an ancient-looking Hawken rifle. His eyes, however, were sharp and intelligent. He introduced himself as Isaiah. He looked from Eliz's determined face to Jed's fever-flushed one and seemed to make a decision. "He's in a bad way," Isaiah grunted, his voice like rocks grinding together. "Bring him inside. The mountains don't care about the laws of men, and neither do I." For 3 days, Isaiah's cabin became their sanctuary. The old trapper was surprisingly skilled in medicine, applying a poultice of herbs to Jed's shoulder that drew out the infection and brought down the fever. As Jed rested and recovered his strength, Eliza helped the old man, cooking with his supplies, mending his worn clothes, and listening to his stories of a time before telegraphs and railroads, when the whole world was wild. In this fragile haven, surrounded by the silent majesty of the mountains, the tension between Jed and Eliza finally eased. One evening, as they sat before Isaiah's fire, Jed finally spoke of Martha, of his son, and of the profound loneliness that had defined his life for so long. Eliza, in turn, spoke of her father, not the gambler who had led her to ruin, but the man who had taught her to read and to ride, the man whose love had been the only steady thing in her chaotic childhood. "I never thought I'd trust anyone again," she said, her gaze fixed on the flames. "After what Silas did, after being hunted, I thought the only way to survive was alone." "Solitude's a cold comfort," Jed replied, his voice raspy. "It keeps you safe, but it starves the soul." He looked at her, the firelight softening the hard lines of her face. "You brought my home back to life, Alora." He used her old name, the name she had given him when she was a stranger. It was an acknowledgement of the person she was, not the name on the poster. A fragile and spoken understanding passed between them. This was more than a partnership of necessity. It was a bond, forged in desperation and tempered in shared hardship. Their peace, however, was destined to be short-lived. On the 4th day, Isaiah returned from checking his trap lines with a grim look on his face. "There's a man down in the valley," he said, his voice low. "Asking questions. A bounty man. Smart one, too. Name's Cale. He ain't like the others. He's patient. Tracks like a wolf. He knows you came into these mountains." The sanctuary had become a trap. Cale, the bounty hunter, was circling. To stay was to wait for him to find them. "We owe you a debt we can't repay," Isaiah Jed said, getting to his feet. His shoulder still ached, but his strength had returned. The old trapper just shook his head. You mean nothing. The mountains provide. Now, listen close. There's a pass to the south. It's treacherous. They call it the Devil's Tooth, but it'll take you out of these mountains and onto the plains toward Cheyenne. Cale won't be expecting you to take it. He'll think you're still too weak. As they prepared to leave, Isaiah pressed a heavy leather pouch into Liz's hand. For the journey, he said, the mountains provide. Inside were dried meat, hardtack biscuits, and a small bag of salt. They left under the cover of a moonless night, the old trapper's final words echoing in their ears, stay off the main trails. And trust the horses. They know the way better than you do. They were running again, but this time, they weren't just running from the law. They were running from a specific man, a patient hunter who was now hot on their trail. The Devil's Tooth was aptly named. It was less a pass and more a jagged scar carved into the mountainside, a narrow, treacherous trail of loose shale and crumbling rock that clung to a sheer cliff face. To one side was a wall of granite, to the other, a dizzying drop into a pine-choked canyon. The wind howled through the pass, a constant, malevolent force that threatened to tear them from the saddle. They moved slowly, the horses picking their way with delicate, sure-footed steps. Jed, his strength mostly returned, took the lead, his eyes scanning every rock and shadow. Eliza followed, Diablo's reins held tight in her hands, her trust placed entirely in the animal beneath her and the man ahead of her. They knew the bounty hunter, Cale, would be behind them. He would have found Isaiah's cabin, found their trail. It was a race, not of speed, but of endurance and cunning. They were nearly through the pass, the trail beginning to widen as it descended toward the foothills, when a rifle shot cracked through the air, echoing off the canyon walls. A chip of rock exploded from the cliff face inches from Jed's head. Get down, he yelled, throwing himself from Dusty's back and pulling the mare into the cover of a rocky outcrop. Eliza was already off Diablo, her pistol in her hand, her back pressed against the rock. High above them, on a ridge overlooking the pass, a lone figure was silhouetted against the sky. Cale. He had outmaneuvered them, circling round to cut them off at the exit. Jedediah Stone, Cale's voice boomed, carried by the wind. You can't run forever. The reward says dead or alive. It makes no difference to me which. Another shot ricocheted dangerously close. They were pinned down, exposed. Jed peered around the rock. Cale was well positioned, with superior cover and a clear line of sight. A direct assault was suicide. He's got us trapped, Eliza said, her voice tight with tension. What do we do? Jed looked at the narrow trail, at the sheer drop. He looked at the sky, where dark clouds were beginning to gather, promising a storm. An idea, desperate and dangerous, began to form in his mind. The horses, he said. We can't outshoot him, but we might be able to outsmart him. He pointed to a section of the trail ahead, where a pile of loose and stable rocks was perched precariously on the edge. When I give the signal, I want you to fire 2 shots, quick as you can, at the cliff face right above him. Don't try to hit him, just make him duck. It's the only chance we'll get. And what will you be doing? She asked, her eyes wide. Creating a distraction, he said, giving her a grim smile. He took a deep breath, then yelled, now, Eliza. Her 2 shots rang out, the bullets sparking against the rock just above Cale's position. As the bounty hunter ducked instinctively, Jed burst from cover. But he wasn't running at Cale. He was running at the horses. With a powerful roar, he slapped Dusty and Diablo hard on their rumps, sending them galloping wildly down the trail, away from the fight. Cale, recovering, saw the fleeing horses. His prize money, his bounty, was escaping. Greed overriding caution, he stood up from his cover to get a clear shot at the animals. And in that moment, Jed fired his Winchester. The shot was true. Cale cried out, not in pain, but in surprise, as the rifle was knocked from his hands, clattering down the rocks. He was disarmed, but alive. Before either man could react, a low rumble filled the air. The gunshots, echoing and vibrating through the unstable rock, had started a small rock slide. The pile of shale Jed had spotted began to shift, then cascade down the mountain, right across the path where Cale stood. The bounty hunter scrambled back, but the trail crumbled beneath his feet. With a final, desperate cry, he slid and tumbled down the steep slope, disappearing into the thick pines of the canyon below. Silence returned, broken only by the whistling wind and the distant rumble of the approaching storm. Jed stood, his rifle smoking, his heart pounding. He had won. They were alive. He found Eliza, her face pale, her pistol still clutched in her hand. He went to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. They stood there for a long moment, the storm breaking above them, the rain beginning to fall in cold, cleansing sheets. They had survived the Devil's Tooth. Below them, the vast, open plains stretched toward Cheyenne, toward the hope of justice. Cheyenne was a city of noise and frantic energy, a stark contrast to the profound silence of the plains. Brick buildings stood shoulder to shoulder with wooden storefronts, and the streets teemed with soldiers, cowboys, merchants, and women in fine dresses. To Jed and Eliza, disheveled and trail-worn, it felt like a foreign country. They found the office of the United States Marshal, a sturdy brick building that represented the highest law in the territory. Leaving the horses in a nearby livery, they walked to the door, Silas Kane's leather-bound journal clutched in Eliza's hand. This was the final gamble. Everything they had endured, the gunfight, the flight, the chase through the mountains, it all came down to this moment. The marshal was a man named Elias Vance. He was older, with a weary, cynical look in his eyes, as if he'd seen every type of human depravity the West had to offer. He listened to their story with a stony, impassive expression, his gaze shifting from Jed's bandaged shoulder to Eliza's determined face. "So you're telling me," he said, his voice a dry rasp, "that you, Jedediah Stone, a man wanted for a triple murder, and you, Eliza Wainwright, a woman wanted for robbery and the murder of a deputy, are both innocent victims?" He gave a short, humorless laugh. "I've heard taller tales from drunk prospectors." "We have proof," Eliza said, her voice clear and unwavering. She placed the journal on his desk. This was Silas Kane's. He was the leader of the Black Creek Gang. "It's all in there." In his own hand, Vance picked up the journal, handling it with a skeptical air. He began to read. The silence in the office stretched, thick and heavy. Jed and Eliza stood waiting, their fates hanging on the words of a dead man. They watched as the marshal's expression slowly changed. The cynicism gave way to interest, then to a focused intensity. He read pages, then flipped back, comparing dates and names. He stopped at the entry detailing the Rock Creek Massacre. After what felt like an eternity, he closed the book and looked at them, his eyes sharp and assessing. He walked to a telegraph key in the corner of the office and began tapping out a series of messages. Another agonizing wait followed. Finally, a reply clattered back. Vance tore the strip of paper from the machine and read it. He stood for a long moment, staring at the paper. Then he walked to the stove, opened the small iron door, and tossed the wanted posters with their faces on them into the flames. They watched the images of themselves as criminals curl, blacken, and turn to ash. "According to a witness from the Black Creek Gang we have in federal custody," Vance said, his voice now devoid of its earlier sarcasm, "your story holds. The journal confirms his testimony. Silas Kane murdered Deputy Griggs. You, Miss Wainwright, are officially cleared of all charges." He turned to Jed. "And you, Mr. Stone, are a man who defended his home against known outlaws. The charges against you are dropped." The words were so simple, yet they landed with the force of a physical blow. Freedom. It was a weight lifted, a breath they hadn't realized they'd been holding for weeks. Eliza swayed slightly, and Jed put a steadying hand on her arm. Vance gave them a small amount of money from a discretionary fund. "For your troubles," he said gruffly. "Now, I'd advise you both to find a new place to put down roots. Your old lives are gone." They walked out of the marshal's office and into the afternoon sun, blinking like creatures emerging from a long, dark cave. They were free, but they were also unmoored. They had no home, no direction, nothing but two good horses and a handful of dollars. They stood at the edge of the bustling town, looking west, where the sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and gold. The vast, untamed continent stretched out before them. "What now, Jedediah?" Eliza asked, her voice quiet. Jed looked at the horizon, then he looked at her. He saw not a fugitive or a victim, but a partner, a woman of incredible strength and courage. He thought of his empty ranch, of the lonely years. That life was gone, but for the first time, he didn't feel a sense of loss. He felt a sense of possibility. "I hear the land is good up in Oregon," he said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. Green valleys, plenty of water. A person could build something new there. Something that lasts. Eliza looked at him, her own smile mirroring his. A person could, she agreed. They walked to the livery, their steps in sync. They were no longer running from a past that haunted them. They were riding toward a future they would build together. As they mounted their horses and rode out of Cheyenne, two small figures against the backdrop of a vast and promising sunset, they were not a rancher and a fugitive. They were pioneers, leaving the ashes of their old lives behind to claim a new one, together, on the far edge of the wild frontier.